Imagine for a second you live under a rock. You spend your days eating bugs from the dirt and mice and rabbits or whatever you can catch and drinking from the stream at night.
Why is this bad? After all, you're a happy bear. You got what you need. Let's just say it could be a lot better if you had more information. You'd have more opportunities to do things and get things that you need, like banking and delicious food, or like getting a meaningful job, or doing space travel. In other words, information equals choices, and choices equal freedom. And freedom is good.
Last episode, we learned about an idea from Karl Marx known as Marxism, or communism, which leads to a government system that gives full economic and social control to those in power.
While alive, Karl Marx's ideas never gained full momentum, but they were able to find a home in a European country that had tried its hardest to hold back the scientific, political, and industrial revolutions we've talked about in this series. That place is Russia. Russia! Yes!
Today on TBH History, we find out how Marx's ideas grew into a Russian revolution, and we'll discover how the idea of communism actually played out in reality.
I'm Lem.
And I'm Daniel.
And this is TBH History.
From 1613 to 1917, one family ruled over Russia, the Romanovs. During their 3-century reign, European rivals like Great Britain and France saw scientific exploration, industrial development, and freedom for common people rise, and power and authority for monarchs decline.
The opposite was true in Russia, which struggled to modernize as the Romanovs desperately held onto total control. By the 20th century, rival countries had booming cities with factories capable of manufacturing new inventions like steam engines and light bulbs and radios and medicines.
Russia, on the other hand, was a nation of poor peasant farmers who were lucky if they didn't have to fight over a single apple.
Plus, the Romanovs had done a masterful job keeping their people in the dark. Russian people were mostly poor, uneducated, and illiterate.
Only sour apples?
But why would Russia intentionally keep their people in the dark? To find out, let's zoom out.
Power-hungry political leaders love to withhold information from citizens because the less citizens actually know, the more easily they are controlled and manipulated. This is why, when it comes to politics, the battle over education and information is so important, because knowledge is often the difference between freedom and slavery, and effective political leaders know this. As we'll discover in this episode, a Russian by the name Vladimir Lenin was successful in rising to power because he knew how to control information and teach people what he needed them to believe to achieve his own agenda. American President Herbert Hoover said, "A nation is strong or weak. It thrives or perishes upon what it believes to be true. If a nation is built on lies, it won't succeed. But if it knows the truth, it can't fail."
Little outside information reached average Russian citizens made of mostly peasant farmers. And most of them had no idea common people in other countries were experiencing levels of freedom like never before. However, a guy by the name Vladimir Lenin, who was the educated son of a teacher familiar with the noble family, hated the Romanovs.
I hate the Romanovs. I hate the Romanovs.
And had aspirations of taking power in Russia and beyond.
He dreamt of leading a violent communist revolution,
I like communism, Mama.
beginning in his homeland and eventually spreading his reach into surrounding countries.
A little revolution.
But to make his dream a reality, Lenin knew he needed to reframe Marx's communist message. Marx had thought that capitalism and industrialization would create such a bad world for workers that they'd choose to fight. But this never materialized.
Why do you not fight the capitalist bears?
Capitalism and industrialization made life too good for too many people. Whatever struggles workers experienced under capitalism, it had given them enough hope and benefits that they didn't rise up as Marx had predicted.
But Russia hadn't adopted capitalism and never industrialized to the level of other European countries. Marx saw this as a reason communism wouldn't work in Russia.
It won't work.
But Lenin saw this as his golden opportunity, just like his golden shiny head. Instead of focusing on bosses versus workers like Marx had, Lenin changed the communist message to a broader definition of oppressor versus oppressed. But for his message to take hold, the Russian people first needed to know that they were being oppressed.
You fools! You are oppressed, don't you see it? You are oppressed!
In the early 1890s, Lenin began speaking out against the Romanovs in writings and speeches, and quickly gathered a following.
It's good stuff. Read it, you fools. Read.
He promised that a communist government, with him in charge, would provide a better life for common people.
So much better.
His message was compelling. Life in Russia really did stink. And maybe it was all the Romanovs' fault. Russia had a ton of oppression, and Lenin saw this as a pain point to take advantage of.
Lenin's crowds began to grow, and authorities began to notice. Obviously, trying to overthrow the government is frowned upon, so they arrested him.
I will be back.
He was first sent to a rich guy prison, and eventually was kicked out of Russia altogether. But while jailed and later in exile, Lenin continued spreading his new communist message and gathering followers.
As the 20th century approached, the Russian authorities found themselves in a tricky position. They knew Russia needed to industrialize and step into the modern world, but modernizing would mean more freedom for the people, and therefore less control for the Romanovs. In 1894, Nicholas II began his reign as King of the Russians, otherwise known as Tsar. And according to most sources, he was a very nice man to those close to him.
Tsar Nicholas loved God, adored his wife, doted on his children, and at least desired to be loved by the Russian people. But he refused to allow the required freedom needed for Russia to modernize, and he and his country paid dearly for it.
Eventually, Nicholas did what a lot of rulers do when they find themselves in a tricky spot: go to war. In 1904, Russia went to war with Japan, but despite Russia being a far bigger nation and having a far larger population and military, it did not go well for the Russians.
Years earlier, the Japanese had entered into a nationwide move to industrialize and modernize, and the results showed on the battlefield. Tiny Japan whooped massive Russia, and in less than 2 years, Tsar Nicholas II embarrassingly surrendered in defeat. News of the loss could not be suppressed, and the Russian people were humiliated and outraged.
The need for Russia to change with the times was glaringly obvious, and more Russians began waking up to just how backwards their country was. In 1905, what started as a peaceful protest against the Romanovs grew into a disaster that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. The protesters were asking for limits on the Tsar's authority, and the government responded by killing over 200 protesters and imprisoning almost 7,000. It was now more clear than ever that serious changes were needed.
Tensions between the government rulers and the people continued for years. Lenin continued gathering support from afar, but a spark was needed to ignite change. And in 1914, World War I erupted, providing not only a spark, but a raging inferno that will roast your face.
Thanks to alliances with other countries, Russia was drawn into the war. Tsar Nicholas hoped that the war would distract from the anti-Romanov feelings that had been simmering.
Yeah, Russia.
But he was very wrong.
Ha ha ha.
Due to their large population, Russia had plenty of troops, but because they had failed to industrialize, they didn't have proper weapons and machinery. As soon as fighting broke out, the underarmed and sometimes even unarmed Russian soldiers suffered enormous losses, and many deserted the battlefields. Russia's war efforts were a complete disaster.
Protests and work strikes broke out across the country, and food shortages were common.
Bread and egg to feed our stomach.
Ridden with guilt, Tsar Nicholas II tried to rally support and lift morale by heading to the front to lead the troops, but his last-ditch efforts were far too little, and much too late.
Okay, no need to fear. Tsar Nicholas is here. Okay, what did I miss?
By 1917, things had gotten so bad, Nicholas admitted that he had failed and stepped down as leader. That plus the Romanovs' questionable relationship with a weirdo named Rasputin.
The prophecy. If I die, no one gets by.
Who just wouldn't die. He just wouldn't die. He just kept living. It was weird. He did a lot of weird things. Weird dude. Weird fella.
For the first time in 300 years, a Romanov no longer ruled over Russia, and Lenin pounced. It was time to return to his homeland and fight for control. In Lenin's absence, Soviets had grown in number and were rising in popularity. When Lenin arrived from his foreign exile, the Soviets were ready to be led and ready to fight. Lenin had his army, and civil war exploded.
Lenin's Soviets, who became known as Bolsheviks and were nicknamed the Reds, battled for power against a collection of anti-communists nicknamed the Whites. Some of the Whites were conservative and favored many of the ways of the departed Romanovs. Others were liberal, wanting to explore capitalism and give the Russian people more freedom.
The communist Reds hated capitalism and had no plans for expanding freedom. Lenin wanted total control and complete authority over the Russian people, and in return for their freedom, he promised to provide 3 things that the Russian masses were in desperate need of: peace, land, and bread.
At the beginning of Russia's civil war, the communist Reds were outnumbered. But Lenin believed he could win if his Bolsheviks controlled the flow of information.
No, 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 no.
So he focused energy on taking over train stations and post offices. And it actually worked. Crazy. Smart dude, I guess. Fighting between the Reds and Whites lasted for over 5 years. But in the end, Lenin and the communists were victorious.
Oh, we won! Do you think you can smile now?
Along the way, in a period known as the Red Terror, the Red Army savagely murdered landowners and anyone they could find who had held a leadership role under the Romanovs. The Bolsheviks placed the Romanovs under house arrest, and most likely on orders from Lenin himself, the entire family was put to death. Tsar Nicholas, his wife, his 4 daughters, and his young son, all executed.
By 1922, the Red Army invaded neighboring regions and forced them to join Russia as communist. And Lenin named his new government the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, otherwise known as the USSR, or just Soviet Union for short. What were you thinking, Lenin? Too long. No wonder it didn't last.
The Russian Revolution was over. The world had its first communist nation. And what became of it? Well, you can't find the USSR on a current map of the world. Turns out Lenin and the Bolsheviks didn't provide peace, land, or bread.
In exchange for the people's freedom, the communist government terrorized and intimidated the Russian people for about 70 years. And because of consistent mismanagement and corruption, the USSR collapsed and evaporated in 1991.
Along the way, tens of millions of its citizens starved, and countless others were imprisoned and murdered for having any opinion that the Soviets didn't like.
Silence! Prison will teach you. Utopia is wonderful.
Sadly, Russia's revolution, much like France's, led from one form of tyranny to another. And despite Lenin's promises of utopia, all he really gave Russia in exchange for their freedom was more government abuse and tragedy. So here's what you need to remember from this episode. Russia failed to change with the times. Rather than modernizing, their monarchy held on to absolute authority and faced violent consequences for restricting the people's freedom.
Because of the reluctance to change, Marx never thought communism would work in Russia. But Lenin was able to shape the philosophy to fit his revolutionary needs and create the USSR, the world's first communist nation.
For most of human history, authorities have tried to hold complete control. In this series on revolutions, we've shown that in the last 500 years, the harder that kings, priests, and czars have tried to hold on to absolute authority, the harder they've fallen from the top.
When tyranny has been replaced with freedom, as during the scientific, American, and industrial revolutions, the results have been overwhelmingly positive for mankind. But when tyranny has been replaced with a new form of heavy government control, as during the French and Russian revolutions, the results have been terror, death, and destruction.
What we've seen consistently throughout history is that when government leaders promise utopia or some benefit in exchange for control, it doesn't usually work out for common people very well.
The unfortunate reality is that power corrupts, and governments that hold large levels of power end up abusing it.
The best thing for people is to try to give them freedom to lead their own lives under a government that protects their rights. It turns out you can make better decisions for yourself than a politician who knows nothing about you.
We here at TBH History hope this series has shown that when it comes to choosing between freedom and lofty promises from government leaders, really, freedom is the only choice.
Now it's time for the thought-provoking question. Which revolution in this series has had the biggest impact on your life that you can think of? Let us know in the comments below.
Thank you for watching this episode of TBH History for PragerU, which concludes our series on revolutions. We want you to post a railroad emoji in the comments below if you're still watching this and tell us the reason why. And at some point out there, somewhere, somehow, we'll give you a shout out. Lim, come, shout out.
Oh, yes, time for the shout out. Research for the shout out. Ruth Strid says, pretzel emoji because space. Karl Marx was German, and so are pretzels. That's correct, but you didn't capitalize German. But good job, you win. Ruth Strid, you win the shout out.
From Daniel and Lim
Yes.
here at the TBH studio, we would like to thank you for watching this whole series on the revolutions that shaped our world.
Because we know for sure you watched them all. Every
watched them all.
last episode to the last minute.
Can't wait to see you in the next series that we do here at TBH. Very crunchy.
Yes.
Kind of hurts to swallow.
Oh.
Come on, Lynn.
But yes, okay. All right. Okay, where are we going?
In the dark of the night, something will find you. Ha 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 ha.
You can't kill me. I ate the chicken pot pie.
Always watching, Wazowski.